All right. Happy Friday, everybody. I am Christopher Lind, and welcome back to another future-focused weekly update where my goal is to keep you 10 steps ahead of the game of everything that's happening at the intersection of business, technology, and human experience. And this week, I have got some fire stuff. I'll be a little fired up, although I think everybody who listens to me knows I get pretty fired up about a lot of things. But this week in particular, some really interesting stuff going on. So some will be a little more serious than others, but that's kind of the name of the game for this. If you listen to this and you benefit from it, it would mean a great deal to me if you shared it with someone, told somebody about it, and went out and gave it a review or a rating. Always helps other people find this stuff because really I do this for you. So my goal is to help people just understand all kind of the craziness that's happening out there and how to make sense of it, how to think about it. I think there's so much pressure to just move fast and go quick. And we see these headlines and it's easier to react to these headlines without really taking the time to slow down and think about what it all means. And my goal is to hopefully help us do a better job of doing that. So like usual, I'm not going to run through what my topics are ahead of time, although by the time you listen to this or watch this, I'll have done the show notes so you'll know what's in here. But I don't do that because I'm kind of being mindful of the time and I don't know how many I'll get through. So let's get started with it, not waste any more time. So the first one this week came up at the end of last week. I read this announcement. Samsung is going through some rough times right now, as I think a lot of companies are. I don't think that's unusual. But what was interesting about this article is it was talking about the fact that now Samsung has made a mandate to all its executives that they have to work 6 days. So this is now just an company-wide mandate out to the senior leadership saying you got to work 6 days a week. And I read this and I had mixed feelings on this for a couple of reasons. And I have no doubt that I've got people kind of spread across different seniorities in my audience here. So you may have different reactions to this. And there might be some that, feel it's ridiculous. There might be others that go, yeah, good for them having to kind of make the senior leaders have to put in some extra time. I guess when I look at this, there's a couple immediate reactions, and then there's a bigger reaction that I think goes to something that we should all be thinking about. But like initially, I need more detail to really understand my initial reactions to this. Because when I hear this at first, I saw some of this brought me back to when Twitter and Musk kind of did this. They kind of went bonkers with this at Tesla, where it was like, oh, everybody's got to work these crazy hours and things like this. And one of the things where I would be supportive of a move like this in theory would be if the rank and file are being expected to put in extra hours and expected to do all this other stuff, and senior leaders have kind of stayed on the sidelines going, yeah, you all do that and try and dig us out of this mess. We're going to kind of keep doing our usual thing. Then I would say, okay, fine that you're trying to do this. But I think what's missing from this headline that just really makes me disappointed in kind of where things are going. And it ties to my intro where I said there's so much pressure right now to do more, go faster, give all of this. And the vast majority of people I encounter, they're tired, they're exhausted. There's a lot of burnout with this. And the tendency when things get tough is to want to push harder, go further, just do more. But unfortunately, it has the opposite effect that people are often going for. And so not just with the Samsung execs, but just with work in general, there's this temptation that when things get really hard, we're like, well, maybe if we just do more, we can work our way out of it. And it doesn't work. At least the research studies I'm involved with, the things that I end up looking into, my own anecdotal experience has been when you're on the fritz, the idea that you just need to jam more hours into things and eventually it'll just work. It's like running head first into a brick wall and just going, well, maybe if I smash my head into this wall enough, eventually the bricks will break. Instead of looking at the wall and going, are there better, more efficient ways I could look at getting over or getting around this thing? And so when I hear things like this, especially if you listen to previous updates, I talked about the EU did a whole massive study on the 4-day work week. And to no surprise to me, the data was, hey, guess what? We had people working less. We actually performed better. Our companies did better. People were happier. Like the whole thing just ended up being upwards for everybody. So when I hear companies like Samsung going, well, now we're going to jump to 6-day work weeks, I'm like, I'll be watching what happens with this, but I will not be surprised whatsoever if Samsung's decision to move to a 6-day work week for their execs actually ends up further negatively impacting the performance of the company. I would be very surprised if I saw this effort actually lift the company out of it. So with that, I think it's just a reminder to all of us that in this season, in this culture that we're in right now, where everything is just pushing us to do more and do it faster, that there's diminishing returns. We hit the point of diminishing returns. And this is just true of, if you don't believe it in business, just look at fitness. Talk to anybody who's in fitness, and they will tell you, at least if they know their stuff, they will tell you that you can overtrain. You can overextend yourself to the point where you are actually doing more harm than good. And we're in a season right now of economic uncertainty and chaos with all the disruption happening that I totally am empathetic with where this comes from, this desire to go, we are in a rough spot and we really need people to push harder. And what I would encourage leaders, senior leaders, like regardless of the role you play, is to battle against that pressure. And that doesn't mean, hey, go have everybody take a vacation. Maybe that'll help. I understand. And I've been there myself where you go, hey, we got to get some things done. But what I've found is I've had far more success looking at things and saying, where are there things we could take off our plate so we could focus on more important things, maybe even reduce the amount of time and energy we're pouring into things because maybe we're overextending ourselves. And that's part of the reason we're missing right now, is because when you look at optimum performance, when people are tired, fatigued, and overextended, they're not operating at their max capacity. And so that should, at least at a minimum, for any business leader, any leader period in the business world or any sphere, when things aren't going right, yeah, maybe there is a time and a place where you need to double down and pour more into things. And there are absolutely situations where I've seen that is required for a season. But I didn't get the sense from reading this that this was just a short season and that this was just a type of, and of course everybody would say, well, yeah, it's a season until we come out of this. But that could be a TBD. This isn't like we've got this project, we've just got to get across the finish line and then we'll be good to go. This is like, hey, we're in a rough spot. We're just going to kind of like overextend people in hopes of turning things around. So I would encourage everybody, if you're in this, maybe you do need to take some short-term efforts to go this route, but they should be short-term. And you absolutely better, as part of that decision and risk evaluation, be evaluating, would we be better served by evaluating the things we're doing and saying, are there things we could be saying no to? And should we be focusing our attention on different things that actually even potentially frees up time for people to give them back some capacity so they actually can operate at an optimal level? So it was a little discouraging to see this. It's not surprising to me whatsoever, but it came across my desk and I thought, you know what, this is a really good opportunity because I know a lot of people right now are facing this same challenge, are wrestling with the same thing. And I totally empathize with where that is. And I know even in myself professionally, when I get stressed, sometimes that temptation to just push harder comes in. And actually where I've had the greatest success is when I actually slow down and say, let me take a look at what I'm doing and see, is there room for me to get rid of stuff and free up some capacity? All right. So moving on from that one, if you have not heard, Meta has jumped into, well, they've been in the game for a while, but they are jumping, they made a splash. Let's just say that they did a Polish or a really solid cannonball into the big large language model GenAI race last week with the release of Llama 3, their latest release of their GenAI model. And it is fire, to say the least. This is a really solid release coming from Meta. I'm not going to say this is going to torpedo other big players like OpenAI or Anthropic or Google, anything like that. But I think there was kind of this, where is Meta in this whole thing? And yeah, they kind of were doing some stuff, but they really weren't on the map Llama 3 has put them on the map. And I actually had the chance, I spent some time over the weekend and last week playing around with it. I'm thoroughly impressed by what they've put together with this Llama 3 release in terms of its capability, its image generation capability, the way it interacts, the way you work with it. And what was one of the things that was really interesting, you can check this out on their website. You can actually go out and see their press release on this. But one of the things that they did that I thought was really, really helpful versus if you get into this and you start looking at different AI models and all this stuff, you'll see all these benchmarks, which is similar to, if you're familiar with tech, one of the places I used to see this all the time and still do is in graphics cards. You know, you'll see AMD comes out with their graphics card and then NVIDIA comes out with theirs, and they do all these benchmarks with it where it just goes into this ridiculous detail about how many frames and pixels it can handle and all this other crazy stuff it can do. And on benchmarks, you're like, okay, so this looks better. But one of the things that they did that I thought was really fascinating was, and I know some others are doing it too, so this isn't like novel, but one of the things that was really impressive that just, I think, to me validates how powerful what they came to market with was they actually did human evaluation. So they actually did a fairly thorough evaluation from people going, okay, we know here's what the benchmarks say. And by the way, it's crushing benchmarks. But at the end of the day, benchmarks don't mean anything for a product that's used by a person because they're the ones who are going to say, I actually significantly felt it was an improvement and I would choose to use Llama 3 over GPT 3.5 or over Anthropic's Sonnet 3 type of a thing. That's really what matters to these companies is, well, to a person, is it actually benefiting you? Do you see a noticeable difference between this that you would actually move over from a different model that maybe you were more familiar with to using this? And hands down, the Llama 3 data was really impressive. Their 70 billion model was recommended. I mean, people overall, it won every single benchmark. So it beat Claude Sonnet, it beat Mistral Medium, it beat GPT 3.5, and obviously it beat Meta's Llama 2 model, which that doesn't surprise me one bit, but by wide margins. And so again, having spent the end of last week and this weekend playing around with it, I was really impressed with its capabilities. So if it's not something you have gone out and toyed around with, I think it's ai.meta.com or something like that. I can't remember. Or no, if you go to meta.ai, you can use it. And actually, you can use it without even logging in with your Facebook. So if you're someone who's a little more concerned about their data and, you know, wants to be a little more careful, you can use it without being logged in. Obviously, if you log in with your Facebook account, you have, you know, greater access to image creation and other stuff like that you can do. But was really thoroughly impressed, even with its image generation, really solid. Obviously limited in some capabilities, like you can't upload, you know, a document and have it scan that. Its image capabilities are still, it's square. It didn't do landscape imaging. But one of the things that was really fascinating with what you can do with Llama 3 is as you edit your image, and this is where I've been waiting to see the image generation stuff going, is you can actually start to interact and ask it to make edits, and it will make edits in real time. So there were two things that were really interesting about its image generation. So first of all, one, if you ask it to make edits, the one thing that we aren't there yet that I've seen is, let's say you have an image and you're like, I love that image, but I just want this object to change the color, or can you move it over here? It doesn't do that well yet. It doesn't do it at all, actually. It recreates a new image, and that's, you know, what happens. So that's one of the things that I think is you still need that human in the loop on things and get you so far. But then if you really want to get into the weeds, you can't do that with AI. But it actually is super fast at generating multiple versions of it. And then if you want to edit that version, you can say, actually, I want to do this, and it'll spin up a new one. So really impressed with that capability. Also, you can ask it to animate any of the images. So, you know, not into a full-blown video of it, but if you have like an image of a car driving, or you just have an image of a car and then you want that car driving, you can actually ask it to animate it. And it does a really fantastic job of this. So really interesting to watch how these models are evolving. I actually was really impressed with its reasoning skills and its human tone in terms of the way you talk with it, the way it interacts. So super fun. I would encourage folks to at least go out and kick the tires on it. I've said this before in other weekly updates and things like this. It is a little weird right now. We're in this season where you're like, okay, there's all these models, and do we switch? Do we go to this? Do we jump back and forth? I do think you're going to find people kind of find the ones that they're comfortable with. And we're just going to continue to see new releases of each model that keep each other, keep them up with each other. But again, now's the time to experiment and see which one tickles your fancy, if you will. And Llama 3, really impressive. I was thoroughly impressed by what it could do and how effective it was as an LLM. And, it was very fun to interact with. I actually really enjoyed it. I played around with it probably more than I needed to over the weekend. But anyway, worth checking out. Check it out. Curious your thoughts. So if you go out there, I'm curious other people's experiences, but I wouldn't be surprised if, like I said, this one's going to put them on the map. And it's going to be interesting to see where they're going with this next. It's already starting to get integrated into some of their other tools. Again, also really fascinating to watch some of these companies who are making the decision to either build their own, or like if you listen to mine last week, Apple seems more interested in saying, why would we build our own in this capability? We'll kind of spin off and go in our own direction and just borrow somebody else's. Clearly, Meta is not going that way, and they have made theirs open source. All right. On to number 3. So Google had their big event, I think it was 2 weeks ago or something like that. And one of the big things that they announced, there were 2 big capabilities. I'm just going to focus on one. And that was their huge shift and focus on Google agents. Now, this is something that for professionals and just people in general, you need to know about, that this is, in my opinion, going to become the really next big disruptor when it comes to generative AI and what we're going to start to see with some of this stuff. So if you're not familiar with how agents fit into the mix, so if you think about these generative AI models and these large language models that we have right now and how they're typically being used, they're being used as, kind of a support system for a person. Again, even the example I gave before with Meta's new version, you might be trying to edit a script or might be trying to edit an email or brainstorm some thoughts. That's how those things are often being used. We are seeing more and more chatbots start to enter the workforce. I use in air quotes to say they are starting to enter the workforce. But historically, chatbots have been relatively limited in terms of what they can do. And I think anybody from a professional standpoint or consumer standpoint is familiar with the chatbot experience. If you go to any website or your internet goes out, usually the first thing you run into is you end up interacting with a chatbot. And we've seen the advancements from, yes, text-based, maybe there was a little thing on the bottom of the browser tab that said, how can I help you? And you could get some basic things done. We started seeing that advance onto, if you call in, you might be actually talking to an AI agent. You didn't really know what that was. But it sounded, again, with the advancement in voice and its capability, you might not even realize you're talking to an AI agent at the time. But historically, what they were capable of was relatively limited. So if you needed something, just as a good example, I've spent a lot of time around healthcare. Say you're calling your insurance agency, your health insurance, and you're trying to find out detailed things about your plans or stuff like that. A chatbot agent in the past could maybe get you some basic questions, might be able to pull from some of the stuff. Hey, here's some basic answers that you've asked. That's the kind of stuff when your internet goes out, it's like, hey, did you reboot your router? You're like, yes, I rebooted my router. Did you unplug your router? You're like, yes, I know. So really was on a much more basic level, which didn't necessarily always fare out well for more advanced type or complicated situations. Like I said, like your health insurance, if you called in and got an AI, you usually pretty quickly were transferred to a human agent who would then take over, not only because they were capable of, answering more complicated questions or connecting you with the right people. Usually, for the most part, when you call in for things, especially around more complicated things, you're not just calling in so that you can know. You're calling in so that it can take action, so you can do something. And historically, the agents, the AI agents at least, they haven't really been very capable of doing that, if at all. Really, they have not. And you've heard me talk in the past about multimodal AI and where that's starting to go, where it actually is capable of doing more than just one thing. Well, this is part of where Google's going with their Gemini agents and this big advancement, which Google's not the only one getting into this space, but Google's announcement about this, in my opinion, is going to be one of these big surges into the professional sphere of, hey, AI agents are going to be far more capable than they have in the past. And so as we start looking at how AI can start to be used, they can be trained on much more complicated, advanced problem-solving type deals. And then also, because they can become multimodal, they can actually do additional things. So instead of just engaging in a conversation with you, and then the second you're like, oh, thanks for that information, can I change my plan? Oh, let me connect you in with an agent who can help you with that. The AI will actually be able to take care of that for you, make changes to your plans and do all these other things. Now, that's just one example, but hopefully that paints the picture of what's actually happening with this. Now, as you can imagine, this has a lot of mixed feelings, I think, from people. I mean, for business folks, I think there probably is going to be a bit of a hype cycle around this is great. We can have AI doing all these other things, that are typically basic, more basic human work. So potentially we might not have the need to do this. I don't know what the pricing on this stuff looks like. If you've listened to my stuff in the past, some of this fear around, oh, AI is just going to take all the work away from people. AI is still relatively expensive to implement. And so as it currently stands, people are still cheaper than AI is. And so I don't think we're quite at a point where you're just going to have to necessarily worry about that. But it does start opening up the door of, okay, how far are these AI agents going to go in their capability? And also as a business, I'm just going to caution people, you still need to be really, really careful with this stuff. And it's been well over a month now, but with the Southwest Airlines, I think it was Southwest, or maybe it was American Airlines. But anyway, where the AI was legally accountable for what it did. And so I'm excited for some of this stuff. And actually, as an employee or a professional, this may sound concerning. And in some ways it is. If your profession if what you're doing at work is simply taking orders, it's very mechanical and robotic. The advancements in AI agents, you have good reason to maybe go, hey, I might want to upgrade my skills or start to figure out what other higher order activities I might be able to focus my attention on. That would be my advice to professionals right now, is to really do a thorough analysis of the work you do and say, how much of this really is extremely robotic, repeatable type of a thing, even if it's complicated. Because I think that's been one of the things that historically we've seen with AI is, well, if it was complicated, AI couldn't do it. And so people felt a little more secure that, well, the work I do, it might be really robotic, it may be really repetitive, but it's extremely complicated. And there's a lot of things that have to be taken into account. So AI can't do that. And with Google's announcements of their new Gemini agents, and others are going to very much follow in suit. And I know I've talked to a number of companies that are already going down this path. The complication is not going to be a savior for your job. And I don't say that to freak people out. Anybody who listens to me knows, I'm not one to get people on the extreme, paranoia type stuff. But it really should have people going, I shouldn't rely on complexity as the savior for whether or not my job is going to be disrupted, because these advanced agents now are going to be able to handle far more complex things than they ever have before. And because we're moving into multimodal AI, they can do more than one thing. So instead of just have a conversation, they also can physically go into the system and then change plans and things like that. So just because there's complexity to the work now doesn't mean that, oh, well, people will have to do that forever. On the flip side, to businesses, I'm going to caution you, if you're a business leader listening to this, be careful how quickly you jump into this and the amount of risk analysis you do into this, because just because something can do things more complicated, it's going to make mistakes. it's still in my opinion, early stage in terms of what it can do. And there's a lot out there promising, oh, AI can solve all this stuff with no risks. It's completely, and it's not. It's just not. I talk to people who are far deeper into this stuff than I am, and even they talk about some of the instability and stuff. Now, granted, people are unstable and they make mistakes and things like that happen, but the way our systems are set up, there are ways to handle human accountability and AI accountability. We haven't quite figured out from a legal and professional standpoint. And so before you start just going, great, let's just sign up a bunch of agents to take care of a lot of this autonomous, complex work, you may want to watch this closely and really make sure you thoroughly understand it. Because the other thing is, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest inhibitors to this, is we do not understand work as well as we think we do. And so, yes, in theory, a AI agent can handle super complex work, but that assumes that you actually understand what that super complex work is to be able to train it. And you have the data, large amounts of data, to be able to train it on these complicated things. And those are two areas that my observation has been, they're still significantly lacking. So, for those of you who may hear this about AI agents, advanced AI agents, and go, oh no, this is Larry Summers, like you talked about last week, or that I talked about last week. This is it. Like, it's eliminating human labor. We got a ways to go. We got a long ways to go. And like I said last week, we're just going to come up with new work. And actually, that's where I'm encouraged about these advanced agents, because my frustration has historically been they're good for very, very basic, simple things. And that's definitely parts of work, but it definitely isn't a lot of work. And so now it's going to be able to open the door and the floodgates in terms of what we're able to do, but further create some uncertainty and kind of chaos around where and when and how that's going to come together. All right. So this next one, Anthropic, and Sean McDowell, I know you catch this sometimes. So if you hear this, thank you. I heard your take on this. I've got some additional points, but Anthropic came out, they did a pretty sizable study on AI's persuasiveness, and they released the results of this. And, no surprise, here's the headline. Here's the clickbait headline that I think a lot of times will grab people's attention, and I want to go beneath that. And so the clickbait headline is, AI is nearly as persuasive as humans are today. It's only a matter of time before they're even more persuasive than people. My initial reaction to this, as I dug into the survey a little bit deeper, is it's a bit misleading in terms of what it's saying. So it's saying AI is persuasive. And if you look at how they structured the study, they gave AI a series of parameters, and then they had people ask a question, and then it responded, and then their persuasive answers were evaluated, on how much it convinced people of things, how persuaded were people by this. The reason I kind of cringe when I hear like AI is persuasive is we often fail to recognize, and I think this is just largely because many people don't understand how technology works and what goes into it. There is so much human intervention even in what they did. So even though this was a very basic study where they gave it basic parameters, it was prompted, then the response it gave was then evaluated by people. First of all, the parameters that it was given, that was all people. It was all people giving it these parameters. Like, here's the criteria here. They engineered a prompt to tell it how to respond to this. So the AI itself was not persuasive. It was given by a person a series of very specific parameters in terms of what it could do, the parameters by which it could come up with its response. Then what it was asked was, again, it was asked by a person, so that's fine. But the response was based on these human outlined parameters. Now, granted, I think one of the things, and so again, my point with that is we've got to be really careful when we hear AI is this, AI is persuasive, AI can do this. It's like, well, AI is not autonomous as of yet, and that's an update I have. I'll talk about that more, not this week. But, autonomous AI is not here. So AI is not yet just operating on its own fruition. It's not just doing things because it decides it wants to do things and it's just taking action on its own. Everything it's doing is based on a human input. Somebody's telling it to do this and that, and it's giving it these parameters and all this other stuff. So it's a little misleading when we say AI is already becoming as, persuasive as a human being, and it's only going to get better. Now, that said, I think one of the things that's really important on this is that AI's very capable of taking a person's input and parameters and making it very persuasive. Now, I think that is the message that everybody should be taking from this is, hey, don't think you can't be fooled by something that's AI generated. And that's something that, if you've listened to some of my recent talks on cybersecurity and kind of where we're going with things, this is a serious thing that if you don't believe you can be fooled by AI, you are extremely vulnerable. And I think what this research does bring out is, yeah, you are vulnerable. And something generated by AI, we're getting to a point where you're not going to be able to necessarily distinguish, oh, that was AI. I'm not going to believe that. And the way it can do things is very creative, very complex. And so it's going to make, which to me isn't new, but it's going to be able to position and present things in a way that is going to deceive a lot of people. And we need to be very, very aware of that, because if you're not, you are that much more likely to be fooled by this stuff. So I do think it is important for people to understand that while, yes, it's a human that's maybe setting up the parameters and prompting this, what AI can then do based on that can be extremely convincing. As convincing as a very influential person. And so to think, oh, I can't be tricked by these machines, I'm too smart for that. No, you're not. No, you're not. And that's one of the things that I think we need to be really careful of, especially when we think about the fact that, and this is probably my bigger concern with some of this stuff, is, so one of the things is you dug into what were some of the parameters that it was given in terms of what it can do to persuade people. It was told, like, you can make up facts and data to be persuasive. Now, I have really mixed feelings about some of this stuff when we think about these AI models and what they can do and how do we govern and regulate. The fact it can be prompted to say completely make up stuff to be extremely convincing. Now, some might say, well, just regulate the snot out of that so it can't do that. But then you think about things like, well, creativity, sometimes you might want it to come up with something that is never been done before, or isn't factually accurate because it's fiction, that you're writing type of a thing. And so you're like, well, okay. So it's not as simple as saying, well, just make AI models that can't make things up and can only focus on facts and data. Well, first of all, it also doesn't know how to distinguish those things very well. And so it may not even realize it's making things up. It's just pulling things from data points. That's what AI hallucinations are. It's pulling from somewhere. It thinks it's a fact. It thinks it's something, and it's representing it in a way. So, but I think the bigger concern I have with this is, because it is capable of making up facts, data, and doing it in a way that is extremely persuasive to people, it can now turn somebody who is not convincing at all and make them extremely persuasive. And I think that is probably my bigger concern with some of this data coming out on how persuasive AI is that people with nefarious purposes, and maybe not just like extreme nefarious, but people who have a hidden agenda, who are trying to do things, who are trying to accomplish, who maybe in the past, they wouldn't have got anywhere because nobody took them seriously. They were a really bad communicator. The way they came across was not convincing to anybody. Well, now you bolt an AI model onto that person. And if you've followed my stuff, you know how easy it is now to generate content, generate video, generate images, all these other things. Well, if AI is capable of taking somebody's intentions, somebody's motives, and somebody says, I'm trying to do this, here are the parameters or lack of parameters I'm willing to give you to pull it off, do whatever it takes to get it here. AI is capable of crafting and creating some extremely powerful stuff. And I think that's the part that has me more concerned with how effective it is at persuasion, is that as we move into what I'm calling the age of distrust, we have to be so much more discerning. We have to be so much slower in our reactions and our responses to things, because somebody who wants to can hijack this technology to do some incredible things, incredible or extremely nefarious. And that's something we've got to be really, really mindful of and really be watching out for. And I think there's no way around it. The train's left the station. We can't say, well, let's just turn these things off so people can't do that. There's just not. And I've got a couple episodes coming up where we talk about some of the ways, some of the efforts that are going into this to try and help distinguish this. But at the end of the day, what AI is doing is it's turning a lot of people into superhumans. And that can be really great. That can also be disastrous. And I think that's the concern I have more about this. Now, one of the things that I'm going to close on this topic on, and then I think I'm actually going to call it quits after this because I'm getting to the time piece, is one of the data points that came out in this that I think was really, really impactful was the fact that people in the study, so they did this study to see how much were people persuaded by these AI responses, these AI generated things. The data was showing that the persuasion did not work, regardless of how effective it was. It didn't work on things that people had deeply held beliefs that those things were fundamentally true. So what I mean by that is, if somebody came in and they had a deeply held conviction that this is true, regardless how effective the model was at, coming up with creative things, making up facts, making up stories, doing things to try and convince this person that it was false, it didn't work. Now, this ties to a concern that I have right now, where I would say more and more, I don't know how rooted people are in truth. And I see this just culturally and societally right now, that this I just think back to Pontius Pilate, responding to Jesus, being like, what is truth? I kind of feel like that's the cultural moment we're in right now, where people are like, well, what's true anyway? Like, yeah, we just kind of keep evolving. We keep learning more about things. We keep discovering things. I don't really hold anything to be fundamentally true anymore. In a culture, in a world where truth, everything is up for debate, this is where this now gets arms, legs, fangs, and it has traumatic capability to us as a society. As we continue down this path of, truth is in the eye of the beholder, we're going to run into some serious problems, because the data showed it was extremely convincing to people who were maybe a little lax in terms of like, no, I'm not deeply held in this conviction. Now, again, could that be a really good thing? Sure. If what you're trying to convince people of is good. If it's not, and people don't have deeply held convictions for things, it's going to be really powerful in swaying them away. Now, those of you who listen to me or have for very long, I have deeply held convictions to a biblical worldview on things. And so for me, some of these things, I'm always looking at things through that filter. Now, I want to be careful because I know that can spark things for people. Everybody's had their experiences with Christians and Christianity, and I know there's been a lot of hurt caused by Christians and by the church institution. And on behalf of everyone in that camp, I'm sorry if you're someone who has experienced it. I've experienced it myself. So I'm not talking about this through the lens of, hey, this is how we can do this. But as an example, when I think about it, one example of this is, like, I have a firmly held conviction that every human matters and is distinct and unique and valuable. Their value is not tied to what they can produce or what they are capable of doing or how they contribute to society. They just are imbued with value naturally. Now, that comes from my biblical worldview, and from my vantage point, that is something that comes outside of just my opinion or, how I feel this week about things. So something like that, regardless of how AI comes at things, I'm going to filter things through the lens of, hey, if you're trying to convince me of something that challenges this idea that, well, this group of people doesn't have inherent value, I'm not going to be persuaded by that. Versus if I'm not rooted in something, all of a sudden I'm much more vulnerable to this idea that, well, okay, I guess that group of people, I guess they are, less valuable to society. Pretty soon you become vulnerable to some of these things. And so regardless, my goal in this is not necessarily to say, hey, everybody, you need to adhere to my worldview. What I'm trying to say is, if you are not deeply rooted in truth, and there are things that are true, you can't just say, well, it's true for you, but it's not for me. If you jump off a 100-foot building, you're going to hit the ground if you don't have a parachute. Like you can't say, well, I don't believe that's true. Well, go ahead and test it. You'll find out real quick. There are just some things that are true and some things that are false. And I think this is going to be extremely critical as we move into the age of disbelief and distrust, that anybody who is not firmly grounded in what is true, you are that much more vulnerable to being persuaded, being misled, being deceived by some of this stuff. And AI is extremely, extremely convincing. And the data is showing that time and time again. And so I think for everybody right now, it's a really good time to really be examining yourself and taking a closer look and going, what do I actually believe and why? And am I confident in my beliefs in these things? And actually challenging and deconstructing some of those things in yourself and going, if I really was pushed on this, do I actually know why I believe what I believe? Could I stand up against something that pushed against this in a way that I feel a strongly held conviction of? Or is it just, I kind of am because that's what makes sense type of a thing? And I think we're seeing more and more in society right now that there are a lot of things that are up for debate. And I think as a result, that makes us that much more vulnerable to what's coming for us with the rise of artificial intelligence. And I think that's just my kind of closing note on this, is I would encourage everyone to take a hard look in the mirror and look at all of those things in your life and really start to examine this, because if you are not grounded in truth, you are going to get rocked by the storm that is artificial intelligence and the age of misinformation, if you have not already started to feel it. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week and a great weekend. I will see you on the other side.